our numbers coming into the room are starting to slow, so we might make a start. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Just wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. So Farmers for Climate Action acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we work, and the traditional owners of the land our guests and speakers are joining us from. So I'm joining from the land of the Djadjawurrung people. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people with us today. So thank you so much for joining us for the launch of our new report, Fork in the Road, the impacts of climate change on our food supply. So I'm the CEO at Farmers for Climate Action. And we're a movement of more than 7,000 farmers from across Australia. So over the last couple of years, we've had our food supply chains break down in ways we've never seen before. Today, when we walk into a supermarket, we can no longer take for granted that we'll be able to buy the food that we're looking for. And of course, COVID has played a role in this, but extreme weather events have added to this disruption. And as the latest IPCC report has shown, this is going to get worse without deep emission cuts this decade. So prompted by the public discussion we've been seeing around supply chains, we turn to Stephen Bartos to tell us how climate change plays into this. So Stephen produced a report for the federal government back in 2012 on resilience in our food supply system. So he was really well placed to take on this challenge. So I'm delighted to be here today launching the resulting report and to be bringing along our report author, Stephen Bartos, as well as Cattle Council CEO, John McGoverne, and also GrainGrowers Chair, Brett Hosking. So we're going to have a chat and talk about the report and its implications for ag and Australian families. So we'll also have a time at the end to take questions from the audience. Please ask your questions in the Q&A section and we will get to as many as we can. First up, Stephen, can you tell us a bit about what you found and were you surprised by what you found as part of this research?
Thanks, Fiona, and thank you also for your acknowledgement of country. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. Yes, look, this report in a way wasn't a surprise, but the things that just jumped out for me were that climate change is already affecting our food supply chains. It has already led to instances of food outages, that is empty supermarket shelves, and it's having an ongoing impact, regardless of the impact of extreme weather events in terms of food prices. Because one of the comments that was made to me, I interviewed a whole heap of farmers and farm organisations for this. Without exception, every single one of them mentioned that the biggest impact on their businesses from climate change was unpredictability. Climate change is adding unpredictability to future weather patterns, and that's very hard to plan for, not just on farm, but in all of the supply chain. And it also results in higher costs because banks and insurance companies hate unpredictability. They increase the prices of things like insurance products, if you can even get them at all. And I'm sure Brett might have something to say about that. And that means there's higher prices that consumers have to pay for their food. What we're seeing is that climate change increases the risk of extreme weather events. And by extreme weather events, we mean things like floods, bushfires, droughts. We're seeing tropical cyclones, although there's probably not going to be more of them. We're seeing them growing in severity and moving southwards. Extreme rain events. Also because climate change produces variability, in some places it's actually leading to more rather than less heavy frost events. So it's all sorts of different impacts, all of which go to that question of how well can our supply chains cope. So Australia is a major food producing country. We export somewhere over 70% of Australia's food production. So we don't have a problem in terms of supply. Farmers in Australia are terrifically good at growing food, but we do have a problem already, and a problem that will just grow worse and worse in coming years in terms of getting that food off the farms and onto the supermarket shelves and onto the consumers' dining tables, because our supply chains are going to be increasingly disrupted by extreme events. I was struck by something that the National Farmers Federation said, and that is that what recent events have done is exposed just how fragile our supply chains for food are in the face of climate change. And that fragility is something that has to be addressed. There are things that can be done in terms of adaptation and resilience, and a lot of farm businesses are already doing that. But by far the most important thing that needs to be done in Australia is actually to cut greenhouse gas emissions so as to do our bit to helping curb climate change. Because, as has been made absolutely clear by the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there are limits to adaptation. If we rely only on adaptation, we're going to get to a point where all of those measures will just be nothing in the face of climate change, because it'll be too extreme for us to manage. So deep emissions cuts, cutting emissions is essential. And now is a really good time to do it. Farmers have actually had quite good seasons. And there is money in farming, and the federal government has the capacity to actually take action on climate change. So there's an urgency, as is made quite clear by the science, but there's also an opportunity. And one of the things that actually did strike me doing this project for you, and I'm very grateful that Farmers for Climate Action asked me to do this report, was the extent to which a lot of the things that farm businesses are doing in order to mitigate climate change are also good for productivity. So the red meat industry, for example, has adopted a target of going carbon neutral by 2030. That's way ahead of the federal government target of carbon neutrality by 2050. But what a lot of the organisations in that particular supply chain, bear in mind there's lots of different food products, so there's lots of supply chains, but in the red meat supply chain, I was hearing that the measures to go carbon neutral are actually also improving productivity. Things like better pasture management, planting windbreaks, better transport systems are helping mitigate climate change, but they're also leading to higher quality meat products. So there are opportunities, I think, for farmers to take. And I'm sure John will have something to say about how important that target of reaching carbon neutrality is for the red meat industry. It's becoming an absolute commercial imperative for Australian farmers. A lot of, remember I said 70% of our product is exported. A lot of export markets are now demanding that Australian farms and Australian farm products are carbon friendly, aren't contributing to adverse climate change. It's become almost the price of entry in a number of markets, including, for example, European supermarket chains. So we should be doing climate change mitigation for its own sake. It's highly desirable, but also simply for commercial reasons, for good business reasons. It makes really good sense as well. So the bottom line is that, yes, there's a lot of things that can and should be done on adaptation and resilience, but emissions cuts have to be the top priority.
Thanks, Stephen. And I just wanted to throw to John here. So John McGoverne, CEO of Cattle Council. John, can you share your reflections on the report and what this means for the cattle industry and Aussie consumers? We've seen incredible price rises for beef recently. Do you think this has peaked? Are we likely to see it go further? Tell us.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona, and thanks for the opportunity to come along today. I think, look, the report I think is a very timely one. We've obviously seen a number of shocks in the supply chain over the last few years. The most apparent one at the moment is obviously the floods in Australia on the coast and the impact that's having on supply chains. If we look more broadly from a global perspective, we've got a war in Ukraine at the moment, and that's also, I suppose, presenting some problems, and being, as Stephen has already mentioned, being an industry that is highly reliant on global markets, we need to export about 70% of our product. So any of these global shocks that come along are a challenge for us, but I also think they're probably an opportunity because they give us an ability to look at where these shocks are, and if we use, some of these crises that are occurring and will continue to occur as a result of climate change, these provide us an opportunity to identify where we've got some real issues, and particularly from a cattle industry perspective, our supply chain is a long one and it's a complicated one, and there are a lot of players in it. And if we look at, there's obviously the production aspects of it, which Stephen has already mentioned, and the industry is working towards adaptation to improve our ability to mitigate the impacts of climate change, but also, we're looking at how we can be a part of the solution to it as well. And, that requires some long-term thinking and some long-term commitment from the industry. And it also requires a lot of long-term thinking and commitment from government. And this is probably where, we have struggled to maybe get some coordination, I suppose, between industry and government on this. And it's one of the things that, as Stephen's already mentioned, industry needs certainty to be able to invest, and if it's not there, we will struggle. So the government obviously has a role in the policy settings. It also has a role in incentivising industry and stepping in where there is a market failure to get us to a position where we can actually take over from government in some of these aspects, and then be able to ensure that these supply chains are maintained. So I think from that perspective, it really is, this report provides an opportunity to start that discussion in a more constructive way, and perhaps a little bit less of a piecemeal way than what we've probably had before. So I suppose if we just look at the current situation, and there's obviously impacts on roads, for the red meat industry in particular, there's always constraints, particularly around cold storage. And, we can only store beef for so long before we run out of room, and, any disruptions to whether it's shipping or in domestic freight or other supply chain components, then we struggle pretty quickly on that part of it. So we need to look at this current situation and others to take the opportunity to see where these blockages are, and I suppose if I sound a little bit pessimistic about the whole thing, the other thing that's not mentioned in the report is that, social breakdown is the other component that can result out of these impacts. And COVID gave us a pretty good example, but Hurricane Katrina, when that went through New Orleans, really demonstrated how quickly social cohesion can break down. So, that probably all sounds a little bit apocalyptic, but that's some of the issues that I think we need to look at from a cattle industry perspective. The obvious one is drought and how long they last, and our ability to mitigate the impacts of those. We need to look at how we manage those better, and to be fair, we've got a hell of a lot better, but I think we've got a fair way to go as well. The danger with it, these continual cycles of drought and flood, is that we are now, herd rebuilding phase, and that's obviously contributed to very high cattle prices. The danger being that we never actually get back to full production because another drought comes along before our breeding herd gets back to capacity. So, if we're on this continual boom bust cycle, that's going to prove very difficult. And I suppose the other part of that is that, from a business perspective, while the production sector is very keen and happy with what's happening at the moment as far as cattle prices go, the processing sector is feeling a fair bit of pain out of this. So, ultimately everyone in the system has to make money. And the danger is that if you know, one part of that system fails, then we all fail. So that's probably the other thing we need to keep in mind. So I'll probably leave it there for the time being, Fiona. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Great issue to think about there. And I'm going to throw now to Brett Hosking, the chair of GrainGrowers. So Brett, what are the key ways we're seeing the grain supply chain being impacted? And what do you think will happen in the future? Are we going to see the price of bread rise even further?
Yeah, I think our morning toast is safe, as is my morning bowl of porridge. But thanks, Fiona, for having me, and thank you for the Farmers for Climate Action team for bringing a report together and, you know, I guess challenging us to think about what the future holds and where our industries are going. And can I also just say I'm loving the comments of where people are from popping up in the chat. So keep them coming if you're listening out there. But I think for the grains industry, we do produce a bulk commodity. There's no doubt about it. And bulk commodities rely on heavy transport, you know, moving to ports, largely exported in the grains industry. So, you know, we're very reliant on, you know, our heavy vehicle freight, our high productivity truck vehicles, our rail system and rail network. And some of these, you know, as we see some of the impacts of climate change and that, you know, it's almost that infrastructure that almost becomes most vulnerable to a lot of the extreme weather events that we do see, which is a real challenge. You know, the other thing that we have noticed as a trend over the last few years in the grains industry is around biosecurity and the changing face of pests and diseases as they're travelling around the globe. And, you know, we're very fortunate in Australia. We have a really robust biosecurity sort of border protection network. But you know what, we need to continue to invest in it and make sure we keep it right because, you know, incursions of pests and disease can cost our industry and cost our markets and those sorts of things. You know, we're really lucky that we've been able to intercept many of the I guess the particularly nasty, you know, insects and that come to our borders, but they're still out there and they're still moving and they're changing the way they behave as well. So we need to be adaptive in the same way. There's opportunities though, to be sure, out of climate change and you know, I'm a big believer in the ingenuity and innovation of our growers themselves. We've seen shifts in the grains industry towards no-till cropping, which is, you know, certainly protecting our soil here in Australia. It's helping us better manage our moisture in our soil, helping us build our carbon profile in our soil, but it's actually making us better and more productive farmers to some of Stephen's points earlier around, you know, a lot of what the adaptation we're doing is actually helping us farm more productively. You know, things like variable rate technology is reducing our costs, as we're seeing at the moment, input costs soaring on, well, you name it, whether it be fuel, whether it be fertilizer, whether it be, you know, parts and machinery or some of the chemicals we use on farm. So, you know, there's some opportunities as the technology and innovation becomes available to farmers to watch them go out there and apply it on their farms and in their businesses and actually achieve things that we didn't probably realise we could do 5 or 10 years ago. So it's great to see. One of the big opportunities we have enjoyed in the grains industry it was largely driven out of access to the European market for our canola, because we're considered a relatively low emissions producer of canola. We enjoyed access to this European canola market for their biofuel program. That's actually grown as we've seen some of the challenges we've had, particularly with barley, for instance, into one of our major markets in China. We've actually had the opportunity to explore other markets. And what we've found is for the first time, we're exporting malt barley into Mexico, into some of your Mexican beers over there, which a lot of Australians love to enjoy as well. And it's done because we're low emissions producers of barley as well. And so the marketplace is starting to recognise some of these factors. One of our larger exporters, CBH in WA, are actually looking at a carbon neutral grain program at the moment. So things like that and exploring what the market demand is for that and what the market will be willing to pay for that sort of product. And that's exciting because what it's doing is it's sending that signal directly back to the grower and saying, hey, the market actually values what you do on farm and how you make a difference on farm, and they're prepared to reward you for it. And if we can get that sort of feedback along our supply chain, then I think the opportunities are incredible. So it brings with it challenges, this space, but there's a lot of opportunities out there as well.
Oh, thanks, Brett. So I'm really interested in these market opportunities that we're finding out about. That's a great example for the grains industry. John, are you able to talk a little more about the opportunities for our red meat industry as we shift to a low emissions future?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Look, I suppose we're looking at a whole bunch of ways we can actually increase probably the demonstration of our provenance in relation to how our food is produced. So, you know, those, particularly the European markets, are becoming more sophisticated and requiring more demonstration of those credentials. So there's plenty of opportunity there for the Australian beef industry to actually get in front of that. And, you know, we've got a pretty good reputation at the moment. And no doubt that the carbon 20 neutral strategy will help facilitate that, and through the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, we're also using that to be able to demonstrate what the industry is doing as far as its ability to combat climate change, but also its other sustainability credentials around land use and ground cover, and a lot of the work that's been done on carbon sequestration now and it's Australia's ability to meet its targets under the Paris Agreement are going to be reliant on agriculture. So a lot of the work that's happening there is going to, I suppose, set Australia in good stead to be able to continue to access those markets, as well as being able to improve our production systems. You know, obviously, if we can get carbon sequestration as part of the everyday thinking of agriculture and our ability to improve our soils, and probably more importantly, or just as importantly, being able to make better use of those varying rainfall events that are going to continue to occur. So, you know, from a production perspective, we are starting to adapt very, very well. There's still obviously always room for improvement, but the industry, I think there's probably been a pretty big paradigm shift in the way industry thinks about climate change now, and how we can better mitigate its impacts. And part of that is being able to demonstrate to customers and consumers that the industry is actually working towards trying to achieve carbon neutrality.
And so there are very clear market signals that the industry is being sent. How are these flowing down to individual farmers and impacting on what they're doing?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's more and more requirement for, whether it's a push or a pull mechanism. There is plenty of, you know, there are a lot of processors and customers that are looking for those provenance credentials. So whether, you know, there are people who are well out in front of the game on this, and some people doing out in the production sector, they're doing some amazing work and really leading the industry. And, you know, building, I suppose, and demonstrating to other producers that you can be profitable and you can build a better business and a better production system that is more sustainable than what we've previously done. So, you know, one of the big challenges is that for industry is being able to accept that there are better ways of doing things. And, you know, at the risk of offending a few people here, I suppose, you know, the agriculture sector is not always too welcoming of ideas that sort of test a few traditional ways of doing things, I suppose. So we probably need to sometimes think outside the box and be prepared to lose a bit of skin along the way.
And Stephen, is this in line with what you heard from other industries as part of the report development around those market opportunities?
Absolutely. So this isn't all a question of doom and gloom. If we do get our act together on combating climate change, this actually represents an opportunity for Australian agriculture. But I did get from all of the consultations I did for this report, a feeling from farm bodies and from individual farmers themselves that they're looking for a lead from the federal government, that without a commitment from the federal government, they think that those opportunities will be lost. So one of the key messages is there's a need for industry to work with government and for government to actually set direction on ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets.
And throwing back to you, Brett, what's the single most important thing that you think needs to happen at a federal level to address this challenge? Just a small question for you there.
Yeah, I'm going to say, wow, the single most. Yeah, look, I think going back to my earlier point, I think farmers themselves are innovators, and I think, you know, through the research and that we invest in ourselves through our RDC levies and the actual application back onto farm, I think if we give farmers the right information, the right tools, they'll solve a lot of the on-farm problems themselves. So I don't know that we have to worry as much about that, but, you know, getting that supply chain right, making sure it's robust and ready to handle the demands of the future. You know, we know infrastructure around supply chains are expensive. We know that. So it needs to be built right and it needs to be maintained. So getting our road network, our rail network right, making sure our ports are efficient. And, you know, what we're seeing at the moment with, you know, conflict overseas, we're seeing, you know, this little bit of nervousness around a lot of markets, and often in the case of some of the poorest people in the world around food security and all of that. And Australia has the opportunity to make sure the rest of the world is fed. We produce way more food than when we could ever eat here in Australia. We already have an obesity problem, and it will get worse if we eat all our food. So we need to make sure it goes out to the rest of the world, and that's really important. But we need to make sure our supply chains are built in such a way that we can respond when those demands are there. And at the moment in the grains industry, we've had come off, admittedly, a really big winter crop, which is great recognition to the skill of our growers, but it's kind of clogged up our supply chain, and getting that product out off our shores and out to those people that need it the most right now is a bit of a challenge at the moment. So by creating a more efficient supply chain, we'll be creating less emissions along the way, but we'll also be making sure that the world doesn't have to wake up in the morning worrying about where their food's going to come from.
And John, to put you on the spot, sorry, is there one thing you'd like to see done at a federal level? Is there anything you'd add to what Brett's saying there?
I don't think there's a one thing. There's no single solution to any of this, Fiona. And, you know, we certainly need the policy settings from the government to be able to incentivise industry to move to a climate neutral position. We also, probably, if there's one thing we do need from the government, is that they need to actually recognise that we've got a pretty big problem, and it's coming at us a hell of a lot quicker than what would be apparent from what we're hearing out of government at the moment.
Yeah, so something, I'm asking the questions here, but I'll also chime in because I've been saying it a bit this morning. What we think we need to see at Farmers for Climate Action is those really deep emission cuts this decade, so that, you know, that challenge is achievable, that we can continue to farm and produce that food for the world. Hey, Stephen, one of the things in the report talks about shortening the supply chain. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah, and this applies mainly to food that's supplied to consumers inside Australia. If you're exporting food, you almost by definition, if you go into a country outside of Australia, have a long supply chain in terms of distance, but shorter supply chains, particularly where farmers supply food direct to consumers, or there's local buyers, are actually very resilient. And we've seen this already demonstrated in the COVID pandemic, that people who have local supply chains with relationships to, particularly in regional communities, their local butcher or their local greengrocer, didn't run out of food. Those supply chains managed, and they're very resilient in the face of climate change. They provide a lot more spreading of your risk. Look, any one supply chain, whether it's a long one or a short one, could be affected by a flood. But if instead of one really long supply chain, you have dozens of small ones, you're spreading your risk, and you're less likely to be affected by an extreme weather event like a bushfire, so or a flood or whatever it might happen to be. So effectively, shorter supply chains are a way of managing climate risk, but they also have other advantages. I mean, this is one of the things that strikes you, that taking action on mitigating climate change can also bring benefits to the average Australian consumer of food. So a short supply chain will in most cases deliver fresher, higher quality food to the consumer. And so they win as well. And one of the bits of evidence that we gathered for this report was that although there's a bit of skepticism from some of the larger farmer representative organisations, certainly bodies like the Open Food Network, who I interviewed, said that consumers are prepared to pay a premium for fresher, locally produced produce, as long as, and this reinforces a point that John was making, as long as they know the provenance of it. That is, as long as they know how and where it's been produced and transported. That information to consumers is becoming more and more important, both in Australia and in export markets.
And Brett or John, do you have anything you'd like to add there about what shorter supply chains would look like in your industries?
I can kick off. You know, we are a largely export dominated industry in the grains industry, but we do have large domestic markets, and we have the opportunity to grow those markets as well through some more domestic manufacturing, well, processing of some of the grains that we produce. So whether it be, you know, creating the malt from barley here onshore and then exporting the malt product, you know, it's more efficient. You are exporting just the product that people need, and so, you know, rather than the same amount of bulk and that sort of thing, you're also creating jobs, creating opportunities here in Australia. And we are a country that, compared to some of the countries that we export to, we are more environmentally aware. There's no doubt about it here in Australia. And so we have that little bit of a luxury of being able to create some of that manufacturing in a more sustainable manner, if that's what we choose as a country to do. So, you know, I think there's opportunities, to be sure. You know, personally, I love shopping local. I love supporting our local butcher, and that's it's an easy argument for me because I always enjoyed a fresher food that way. But you know, I understand we are dominated by a couple of particularly large supermarket chains that would much prefer we walk into their doors and rather than the local stores. So I think that's a cultural challenge we have to address.
Can I mention there, Brett, that was a point that was also raised with me by the National Farmers Federation, and they were saying that there actually is a role for stronger competition policy in encouraging more diversity amongst our food retailers, and I think they've got a point there.
John, did you have anything to add there from the cattle industry perspective?
Oh, look, I probably don't have anything to add, Fiona. I think Brett has covered it really well. Suffice to say, you know, we've got in the meat industry particularly, we've got a very complex supply chain, you know, and we can only sort of store a certain amount of product, and it's because we're largely exporting 70-odd% of it. So, but I think the points that have been made around those market monopolisation by those big supermarkets are problematic to having those shorter supply chains. The other part of it, I suppose, is that, you know, people talk about wanting locally produced stuff, but they're also very keen to have it available all the time, and are they prepared to pay for it? And, you know, that's probably the other stumbling point with it. But I certainly acknowledge and totally agree that the shorter supply chains will reduce our exposure to some of these shocks.
And I'm going to throw to some of the questions coming through from our audience in the Q&A. So the first one is from Pamela Greet, and it's for you, John. So John, you've been working in this policy and industry lobbying advocacy space for some time now. What realistic expectation can we have that the government of any colour and industry will come together to make real change here, supporting and educating and encouraging producers to change? She writes, seeing the vulnerability of our infrastructure and supply chain through the recent wet had been just a little alarming for someone who relies on the supermarket shelf as a source for sustenance.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a very complicated question. But I think, excuse me, I think we're getting through to government that we need to make some changes, and we do a lot of work probably behind the scenes, and it doesn't get a lot of ink about what we're doing. But there is certainly a willingness from government to look at ways how we can mitigate climate change, and the government has got a number of programs in place now around carbon sequestration, biodiversity fund, and some of the other initiatives that are coming out of industry out of government rather, are helping industry, and industry has certainly been part of those discussions. We've been across the whole agricultural sector, been, I think, quite influential in being able to get some good outcomes with some of these programs. So it's been able to provide a way that industry can engage in climate change mitigation, be part of the solution, and getting government to be able to see that there are better ways of doing this rather than a regulatory framework, and imposing regulation on industry is a far more constructive way of doing this. And much of these, if we can set up some commercial frameworks where it will not only help producers actually mitigate the impacts of climate change, work through programs around carbon sequestration, etc., but also potentially find another way to have an income so that they are not wholly reliant on one source of income, and that being from the production of commodities. So, it's spreading risk in other ways apart from just being able to mitigate the direct impacts of climate change and managing a property, but it's also being able to mitigate that economic risk by spreading your income sources.
Yeah. Fiona, if I could just add to that as well, we have this opportunity to meet with a lot of our politicians, a lot of our leaders, and by far and away, they are so committed to making our country a better country. They are so committed to dealing with some of the challenges of climate change and supporting agriculture and all of that. Everyone believes in that, but it's a really big challenge, and they don't always know where to go. They're relying on good advice, and that's why we at GrainGrowers, we go in there and we represent the growers and we tell the story of the growers so that they can understand. But government, no doubt, is at its finest when it partners with industry, when it partners with the growers and those in the industry. And so, if there was one message to government, it would be do just that: partner with the industry and create the solutions together. And out of that, I think we can deal with a lot of these challenges really quickly.
Fantastic. And can I just add, as well as supporting ag in this work, also making sure that our energy and transport sectors are making those big emission reductions as well. I've got another question here. Julie says, the latest IPCC report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability highlights some pretty stark issues for ag and food production from climate change. And it states the urgency of adaptation as a result, and identifies climate resilient development that integrates adaptation and mitigation rather than arguing one is more important than the other. So Julie's interested in the panelists' reflections on how we can move to a more coherent approach on the ground that addresses both adaptation and mitigation in agriculture. But this is a big question. Does anyone want to put their hand up for this one?
I'll kick off if I can, Fiona, because Julie is absolutely right. Adaptation and mitigation aren't either or. And there's plenty of examples where the things you do for adaptation are also mitigation measures. One of the key ones is electrification based on renewable energy. So as farm businesses and supply chain operators and processors move to greater electrification, they're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and they're also adapting to the impacts of climate change, particularly if they can use locally generated short energy supply chain energy. Look, and I'm going to expand out Julie's question even further, because this isn't just an agriculture issue. It also is about energy supply and how the energy industry works. And there's been a recent report by energy distributors that also talks about the need for more resilience in their supply chains. And it's about transport, and it's about retail, and it's about consumer law. So in other words, it's an integrated package of a large number of different aspects that are all required to come together, which is, I suspect, one of the reasons why so many of the farmers that I spoke with were calling on the federal government to lead that, because they can integrate all of these different strands.
Fantastic. We've got a question from David Allen about saying, given the fossil fuel issues at the moment, is there any talk of speeding up the transition to hydrogen fuel for the big trucks and so on? Grains and cattle use a lot of big trucks. Have you heard anything, Brett or John?
We do. We are continually looking at how we can improve the efficiency of our machinery and that sort of thing. The answer is it's not going to happen tomorrow. We are facing some enormous fuel prices at the moment, along with fertilizer prices, along with chemical prices, along with labour costs and things like that. And we know when our growers, pull their machines out of the sheds come, April, May, and they sow this year's crop, they're doing it really in faith this year, because the output cost, like the cost of putting the crop in the ground, is going to be much bigger than it's ever been. So the risk they're taking, the risk they're exposing themselves, their businesses, their families to, is much greater than it's ever been. So yeah, absolutely, we need to have that move towards cleaner emissions vehicles, as a matter of urgency, but the technology is not there yet. So in the meantime, we have to think about, how we manage what we're doing currently, how we can be doing it better and more efficiently, and how along the way we can care for the environment. And just that last question around mitigation and adaptation, one of the things we did do at GrainGrowers a year or so ago was we compared a lot of the carbon calculators that growers can use on farm to kind of get a picture of what they're doing, how they can make improvements. And what we found is they all tell a different story depending on which one you pick up. And so, even things like that, just creating accurate tools so farmers can measure what they're doing on farm, what their footprint looks like, but also, if I make a change, what would the impact of that be? Will it be positive? Will it be negative? Will it be significant? Will it outweigh the cost? All these sorts of questions. So, that report's on our website at www.graingrowers.com.au. So please have a look at it. But, things like that are really important to giving growers the information they need to be able to make the changes that will make them better farmers.
John, you might have something to add to this, but I also have another question for you. So feel free to chime in with what you want to answer there. But also, we've got a question about how close we are to the wide use of seaweed to reduce methane emissions. So, the cattle industry is feeling a lot of heat around the methane emissions issue. And so I wondered if you could talk a bit more about, what's being done? What are the most powerful things that can be done to reduce emissions?
Yeah, well, I'll just finish maybe off on the issue of fuel. Fiona, that one of the obviously the issue is refueling in the cattle industry. I mean, we pull some cattle out of some pretty remote areas, and it's probably part of that infrastructure that will need to be put in place so that all vehicles, regardless of whether they're in industry or private vehicles, have access to alternative fuel sources. So it's part of that discussion that needs to occur through that process. And unless there's a significant change in the number of places that you can refuel using those products, it's probably, as Brett said, it's probably a long way off yet. But it's certainly part of the thinking that's happening in the industry. In relation to the seaweed one, look, MLA is doing a lot of work and research into that, and there are probably people on this chat who are far more qualified to answer this question. But needless to say, the work that's been done and the research is showing some very good results and reductions in methane. My understanding is that it's, you know, reducing methane emissions by well over 90%. The challenge for us will be how do we make it available, and particularly in extensive rangelands production systems, how do we get it into those animals? So, and you know, again, what are the incentives for people to do that? But there is certainly, as I understand it, significant reduction in those methane emissions, but they're all, and as well as some significant production benefits. So animal nutrition and health is also much improved by it as well. So, but yeah, look, there might be someone on this call that could answer that in more detail, but happy to come back with some more information on that one.
Thanks, John. I was hearing recently about a product, I think is it KNOP, that's like seaweed but will be available later this year. It's a chemical compound, I think. I don't know. There seemed to be a low awareness about it. I'm interested in those other solutions as they come through, and yeah, actually getting them through to farmers, because that's a big job, isn't it? We've got a lot of farmers getting that message through, but also what happens for farmers that aren't using feedlots? Because a lot of these solutions, aren't they, are best for a feedlot situation. And the reality is we have a lot of grazing and we want to kind of keep our grazing going. So do you know much more about those solutions?
Not a lot, but and the other product you've mentioned, I haven't heard of it either. So again, there's probably other people more qualified to answer the question. But I think the point of a lot of this is that, you know, there's a significant amount of research going on. MLA have invested a lot of money into doing so, and you know, we're certainly looking at ways as to how, from a policy setting perspective, that we can sort of help with government incentives to actually work on, you know, get that out into the broader industry, because at the moment, I suppose there are a few roadblocks to it, but, you know, again, it's just one of the things that we look at how we adapt, and, you know, from as a peak industry council, what role we play in facilitating that as a, you know, from a policy perspective, or from a you know, an extension perspective, we can help roll those sorts of products out and that information.
Fantastic. So Karen's got a question here. She says some supply chain challenges may be mitigated by biodiversity in product. She's saying, I'm thinking of growing a number of small and startup farmers with niche markets, regen, etc. However, in Victoria, this is being stifled by a lack of abattoirs. Is this something you're seeing at a national level, John?
I think there is a supply chain constraint there. You know, there's a lot of processors now don't do what a lot of abattoirs used to do as a service kill. So, you know, they're basically buying product and selling it overseas under their own brand. So, you know, the challenge is certainly for those smaller operators to be able to access processing facilities that are, you know, relatively close to home. So, yeah, there are some constraints there, is my understanding.
And I'll just say, David Allen's just messaged us saying it's 3 in OP, and he said looking good. So one for us to look up there. Kurt Smith is asking, it was mentioned the Euro market is perhaps more sophisticated and there's demand for low emission product. Do you think that there's the same demand domestically? And if there's not, how do we increase that? I wonder, Stephen, do you have any thoughts on that one? Or...
Yeah, look, clearly we don't have the same pressure to reduce the carbon impact of our food products here as you find in some European markets. I mean, in doing this report for you, for Farmers for Climate Action, Fiona, I looked at some of the policies of some of the major supermarket chains. So, for example, some of the biggest British supermarket chains like Sainsbury's have not only committed themselves to go carbon neutral, but demanding that all of their suppliers at every stage of the supply chain also are carbon neutral. So they're pushing it very hard. So what do we do to move to a similar situation in Australia? I think part of the solution is the work of Farmers for Climate Action and commissioning reports like this to raise awareness so people understand how important an issue it is for us.
Fantastic, thank you. Greg's asked, what's the role of the federal government in all of this? Is it a financial one, so helping finance change? Is it infrastructure, or is it both? Does anyone want to put their hand up for this one? Brett, you're nodding, I can see you there.
I was thinking the answer to that is yes. It is absolutely all of those things. And look, it's even policy decisions around, you know, how they value, I guess, you know, carbon policy here in Australia. And it's a big challenge. And I think to say one is more valuable than the other, it is like a chain. It's only as strong as its weakest link. And if we focus on one part of that chain, then it's going to break somewhere else. So we need to be holistic in our approach. We need to make sure we've got the right infrastructure. We need to make sure that we've got the right policy settings. We need to make sure that we've got the right support for growers, you know, themselves. We need to make sure that we've got the right information, the right research going on as well. So it's an everything answer. And I know that probably doesn't answer the question, but, you know, I think it is hard to look at it any differently than that.
Brett, did you, I'm sorry, not Brett, John, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh, look, I think Brett's covered it well. You know, in the interest of time, I think I'd be just repeating what I've said earlier, Fiona.
No,
you know, you do need those policy settings and infrastructure and funding. It's all of the above.
Yeah. Joe McGoverne asks, are there opportunities for new produce that may be more suitable to the climate of the future? So she's thinking of things like coffee, spices, dates, chia, things that we don't necessarily think of as local produce at present. And she also says, why is it so hard to buy tomato products, mainly sourced from Australian farms? It's a big question. Stephen, do you want to take a first go at this one?
Yeah, look, we're already seeing some of that. So particularly farmers in the north of Australia are changing their product mix to respond to the impacts of warmer weather, which clearly some parts of the north are no longer viable for some traditional products, but they're moving to alternative products. So it's a very good question, and it's something where the biggest gap at the moment is information available to producers to make their investment in a changed product. Because bear in mind that if you're producing a product and that's what you know how to grow, making a shift is actually a very big investment and a big challenge. So you don't want to do it without good information on what's going to be viable. So again, that's where the role for government comes in, to helping overcome those information gaps.
Fantastic. Brett, any grains varieties we should be looking at here that people can diversify into?
We are already seeing a diversification in the grains industry. You know, the growth of pulse crops, particularly through Western Victoria, has been enormous. You know, it's hard to buy a lentil burger now that it didn't come from Western Victoria, which is great to see. And the innovation of growers, the research and development that's going into some of those products is really amazing. We've got some quinoa grown on over in WA and up in northern Queensland as well. Like, you know, it's products like that are being grown around the country. You know, there's growers, I guess, playing around with new varieties. We're seeing new technology coming into the crops we produce, and we're actually improving the quality of what we're growing as well, which is really exciting for the consumer, because it means that, you know, not only are they enjoying a real clean and safely produced product when they enjoy Australian grain, they're actually getting the best nutrition they can out of it as well. So that's a big step forward as well.
So John, it's a long process to shift breeding in a beef operation. Are we seeing a shift towards particular breeds that may be more suited to the climates that we're moving into?
I'd probably say they're adapting to climate change anyway. You know, look, people will make their own decisions as to what breeds they use. Obviously, the Bos Indicus cattle were introduced to because of their ability to handle more extreme climatic conditions, particularly heat. So, you know, there may be a shift towards those type of animals, or, you know, certainly composites that contain those traits that can be sourced from those Bos Indicus animals. So, you know, that may be something that we see more of in the future, that is driven by a change in our climatic conditions. But again, you know, that'll be up to individual producers to make those decisions, and they are best placed to do so. And then, you know, in I suppose thinking about what their end market is and where they're targeting a certain product will also influence those. You know, they're quite complex decisions for producers because you know, to change tack on a breeding program takes a considerable amount of time, and you know, so it's not generally something that's done lightly. And one of the challenges for agriculture, and Stephen's already mentioned it, it's, you know, it takes considerable time and financial commitment to making some of these changes, and so, you know, it's not something you can do on a whim, but certainly there are and will continue to be ongoing research into animal productivity, and part of that will be how we do that is from a welfare perspective as well, because obviously the more extreme climatic conditions we face, then the ability of those animals to handle those conditions will be extremely important, both from a production perspective, but also because we have a moral obligation to look after animal welfare.
So I've very much enjoyed this conversation. I do note that we're coming up close to 3 o'clock. So I just wanted to give each of our speakers the opportunity to have a final word today before we start wrapping up. So I might go back to where we started. So Stephen Bartos, our report author, what's your final message to our audience today?
Well, I've just noticed a very good comment from someone called Magdalena in the chat section about food waste, and that's also referred to in this report. Both the IPCC and the Australian Academy of Science have pointed to the issue that if we can reduce food waste, we also can actually make a big impact on climate change. So what that illustrates to me is, I think, an important message, and that is that a lot of what we do to deal with the problem of climate change is also good for other reasons. It's good for productivity, it's good for saving costs. So we should keep our eye on the fact that if we do take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the various ways that are available to us, then we can actually benefit consumers, benefit farmers, and benefit the planet by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a really good case for action there.
Fantastic. Brett, did you want to go next?
Yeah, look, just a really big thank you to Stephen and the Farmers for Climate Action team for the report and for the challenges that it has highlighted and the opportunities. I mean, without a doubt, there's enormous opportunity for our grain growers, but for all of agriculture, you know, in tackling this carbon space. And as we learn more about it and grow our productivity in line with a more, I guess, a lower emissions intensity in the products we produce. So well done. And I guess the next challenge is what we as a society and what we as our government chooses to do with reports like this as well. So that's the next challenge.
And John, over to you. Do you have any final?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Look, I certainly appreciate you know, the work that's gone into developing this report and the foresight it's taken to actually bring it to fruition. So I suppose if I had a challenge would be for us, what do we do with it now, and how do we take this forum? And you know, there's obviously across the whole production sector and more broadly in agriculture is how do we actually combine our efforts in doing something about this enormous challenge that we're facing. And you know, because we've got people in the cattle industry who are grain growers and vice versa. So you know, we're all basically in this together. So it's how do we actually work together more effectively and structure our policy development and our advocacy and our R&D to actually mitigate and adapt to climate change, and you know, get more impetus from government and industry and across the whole country to actually be able do something meaningful about this in a more coordinated way. But again, thanks for the opportunity, and it's it's been a very insightful discussion.
Oh, thanks, John. So yeah, thank you to all of our speakers today. And something I think it's been a great discussion. Something I forgot to do at the start is to acknowledge that we've got our chair, Charlie Prell, here today. So thanks, Charlie, for all you do for Farmers for Climate Action. One of the great things about facilitating is that I get to have the final word here too. So just to add my 2 cents, we've got lots we could be doing here to adapt and mitigate our supply chain system, and that's on farm and right through. So there's lots we can be doing there, lots of conversations we need to be having, working together, talking to government. But ultimately, we do need those deep emission cuts this decade. We need a bipartisan governmental approach that ensures that we take those cuts now that save us so much risk and so much money in the longer term. Rural and regional Australia stands to benefit from the shift to a low emissions future. And there's also a limit to how far we can adapt. So we need to see that, and we need to see that soon. So we've seen some good first steps with the agreement to a net zero by 2050 goal. So we look forward to working together to see that those important next steps taken. So we'll be reaching out to MPs to talk about this report. We'll be talking to industry, and we'd love to hear from all of you in the audience as well. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but it's been great to hear from you today. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our webinars again soon. So I know that we've got a couple coming up there, one with the Bureau of Meteorology, and I believe one with Landcare as well. So jump on our events page and sign up, because we'll be delighted to see you. So I'll let you get on now with your afternoons, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Fiona. Thank you all.
Thanks.